Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great pleasure to see you here for the fifth of the CRASSH series on understanding society. The first four were in Nokomis, and the next lecture will be next term with Judith Butler. We'll be talking on this theme here. But tonight it's my very great pleasure to be able to introduce Richard Sennett. I'm not going to do a long, excited, praising, laudatory introduction, because you're here to hear him. So, Richard Sennett.
That's the kind of introduction I love. I'm going to read to you, and I'm doing this very selfishly because I'm trying to sketch out what my new book is going to look like. And so I like to, just speak directly, but in this case, I've written this down, and there are even the odd illustration for you to look at, and you can tell me whether they're okay or not. And I'll try to, let me take off my watch. Simon told me, be brief. So I have 55 minutes, Simon. Maybe 55 minutes and 30 seconds, who knows? I'm going to give you a lecture called The Open City. And I'll just start reading it, and we can talk later. The cities everyone wants to live in should be clean and safe, possess efficient public services, be supported by a dynamic economy, provide cultural stimulation, and also do their best to heal society's divisions of race, class, and ethnicity. Now, these are obviously not the cities we live in. Cities fail on all these accounts due to government policies, irreparable social ills, and economic forces beyond local control. The city is not its own master. Still, something has gone wrong, radically gone wrong, in their conception of what a city should be. Perhaps those nice words, clean, safe, efficient, dynamic, are not in themselves enough to confront critically the problems we face. In this talk, I'd like to propose we look at the city in a more embracing way. Currently, we make cities into closed systems. To make them better, we should make them into open systems. We need to apply ideas about open systems currently animating the sciences to animate our understanding of the city. That's my basic theme. More, in an open city, whatever virtues of efficiency, safety, or sociability people achieve, they achieve by virtue of their own agency. But just because a city brings together people who differ by class, ethnicity, religion, or sexual preference, in an open system, the city is to a degree incoherent. Dissonance marks the open way of life more than coherence, yet it is a dissonance for which people take ownership. So those are my two basic themes to you. One, a critical theme that we need to open up an urban system which is closed, and two, when we open it up, the result is a less coherent way of life. So let me begin with the idea of closed, and I'll begin with the paradox. The paradox is that the art of designing cities declined drastically in the middle of the 20th century. And that's a paradox because today's planner has an arsenal of technological tools, from lighting to bridging and tunneling to materials for buildings, which urbanists even 100 years ago could not begin to imagine. We have many more technical resources in the past, but we don't use these resources very creatively. Now, this paradox can be traced, first of all, to the overdetermination both of the city's visual forms and its social functions. The technologies which make possible experiment have been subordinated to a regime of power which wants order and control. A classic example is Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin in the mid-1920s for Paris. Here it is. The architect conceived of replacing a swath of the historic center of Paris with uniform X-shaped buildings. There they are. This is the Marais, by the way. Of course, you recognize it. Public life on the ground plane of the street would be eliminated. The use of all buildings would be coordinated by a single plan. Now, don't let me explain more about this to you, because you'd never go home. Not only is Corbusier's architecture a kind of industrial manufacture of buildings, he has tried in the Plan Voisin to destroy just that element which we will see creates openness in the city. He has got rid of life on the ground plane. Instead, people live and work in isolation higher up. This dystopia has become reality in various ways. The plan's building type shaped public housing from Chicago and Moscow, housing estates which came to represent warehouses for the poor. I'll show you one in Chicago, and I'll show it to you because I grew up here. These are a kind of adaptation of the Corbusier idea, although they're not X-shaped, they're linear shaped. I grew up in this house here. These are low-rise public housing, and these are high-rise, and I'll show you another picture of how it works. And they just multiplied in time. They could be reproduced mechanically. And as I say, this is public housing from Chicago to Moscow, housing estates which came to resemble warehouses for the poor. Corbusier's intended destruction of vibrant street life was realized also in suburban growth for the middle classes, with the replacement of high streets by monofunction shopping malls, by gated communities, by schools and hospitals built as isolated campuses. The proliferation of zoning regulations in the 20th century is unprecedented in the history of urban design, something that an urbanist of my generation had taken for granted, but it was unknown before the Second World War. And this proliferation of rules and bureaucratic regulations has disabled local innovation and growth. It's frozen the city in time. The result of overdetermination is another paradox, namely that these frozen cities decay much more quickly than urban fabric inherited from the past. And that's because as uses change, buildings have to be replaced, since fixed form-function relations make them very difficult to adapt, and I'll show you one later. The average lifespan of new public housing in Britain is now 40 years. The average lifespan of new skyscrapers in New York is 35 years. The overspecification of form and function makes the modern urban environment into a brittle place. It might seem that the brittle city would in fact stimulate urban growth, the new now more rapidly sweeping away the old. But the facts argue against this view. In the United States, people flee decaying suburbs rather than reinvest in them. In Britain and on the continent, as in America, renewing the inner city most often means displacing the poor who have lived there before. But this brittleness tells us something by contrast about the growth of a more open sort. It is more complicated than simple replacement of what existed before. It requires a dialogue between present and past forms, a dialogue which is amorphous and often juxtaposes present and past without any modulation. And in this rather, I'll show you this a little later, in this dissonant way, growth in an urban city is a matter of evolution rather than erasure. Now, in addition to overdetermination, a closed system has two further attributes. These are equilibrium and integration. These two attributes are usually seen as virtues in government policies across the board, not just in urban planning. A program should be balanced and everything should cohere. But urban planning shows why, in fact, equilibrium and integration, just like overdetermination, can be destructive. The closed system, ruled by equilibrium, derives from a pre-Keynesian idea of how markets should work. You should know about this. It supposes something like a bottom line in which income and expenses are equaled out. In state planning, information feedback loops and internal markets are meant to ensure that programs do not overcommit, do not suck resources into a black hole, such as the language of recent reforms of the health service, familiar again to urban planners in the way in which infrastructure resources for transport get allocated. The limits on doing any one thing really well are set by the fear of neglecting other tasks. In a closed system, a little bit of everything happens all at once, which is a recipe for low quality. Do you understand what I mean? If you put everything in an equilibrium and balance, one outcome, as we see in planning and we see in the health system in the UK, is you do a little bit of everything but nothing really well. You're afraid of overcommitting, of imbalance, which is seen to be a sin. Second, a closed system is meant to integrate. Ideally, every part of the system has a place in an overall design. The consequence of that ideal is to reject, to vomit out experiences which stick out because they are contestatory or disorienting. Things that don't fit are diminished in value. The emphasis on integration puts an obvious bar on experiment. As the inventor of the computer graphical interface, John Seeley Brown, once remarked, every technological advance poses at the moment of its birth a threat of disruption and dysfunction to a larger system. It's a profound, simple, but very profound point. The same threatening exceptions occur in the urban environment, threats which modern city planning has tried to forestall by accumulating a mountain of rules defining historical, architectural, economic, and social context. Context being a polite but potent word for repressing anything that doesn't fit in. Context, which is the urbanist view of integration, ensures that nothing sticks out, offends, or challenges. These three attributes of a closed system, formal coherence, equilibrium, and integration, bedevil planners of education or planners as much as planners of cities. The closed system betrays the 20th century bureaucrats' horror of disorder. Put this way, we seem to be on an intellectual terrain, flat plain, inhabited by liberals like Karl Popper, who famously wrote about open and closed systems, societies, or even up on the dizzy libertarian mountain where Ayn Rand and other extremists dwelled. Do you understand that? The notion here is that something that's open is individualized. But I think there is an entirely different way to think about openness. The social contrast to the closed system is not the free market, nor is the alternative to the brittle city a place ruled by developers. May I say here that the cunning of neoliberalism in general, and of Thatcherism in particular, is to speak the language of freedom whilst manipulating closed bureaucratic systems for private gain by an elite. I think it's the absolute trick of Thatcherism. You talk about openness, but it's a smokescreen for an elite manipulating and indeed rigidifying certain rules. Equally, in my experience in planning, those developers in London, as in New York, who complain most loudly about zoning restrictions, are all too adept in using these rules at the expense of communities. The contrast to the closed system lies in a different kind of social system, not in brute private enterprise or individualism. That is, to a social system which is open to different voices who attend to one another rather than who each do their own thing in isolation. So now I come to what I mean by an open system. To the scientist, open systems are familiar companions. Chance events, mutating forms, elements which cannot be homogenized or are not interchangeable, all these disparate phenomena of the mathematical and or natural world can nonetheless form a pattern, and that assemblage is what we mean by an open system. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's the assemblage of elements which is an open system. In time, an open system will probably be nonlinear, and within that framework range from path dependency to the patterns of chance studied by Georgy Markov. In space, an open system resembles a chemical colloid rather than a compound. The most familiar and magnificent open system, familiar to us all, is Charles Darwin's version of evolution, which combines elements of chance mutation, path dependence, and the environment conceived as a colloid within which natural selection does its work. It's the ultimate open system. It's got all these elements. In social thought, the idea of an open system is often associated with Nikolaus Luhmann, and more particularly with his idea of autopoiesis. This beautiful term indicates his belief that human beings create, through mutual exchange, the systems of value by which they live, and that the more they exchange with one another, the more individuated they become. So I find him a very moving writer, even though he's loathed by most sociologists. Yet the exchanges he has in mind are verbal. The world of built forms has no presence in these exchanges, and as it were, no voice of its own. The idea of an open urban system that is physical in form, in which physical forms are given a consequent, the idea of an open urban system is one in which physical forms are given a consequent voice. Put less poetically, there is interaction between physical creation and social behavior. What we call agency in a city is a colloid of these two different activities. To put this more concretely, we need only invoke the name of the great urbanist, Jane Jacobs. Against the overdetermined vision of Le Corbusier, Jacobs argued that places should become both dense and diverse, either in the form of dense streets or packed squares. Such physical conditions can prompt unexpected encounter, the chance discovery, the innovation, which is the locus, the genius loci of cities. Loci? Loci? Loci. I have never studied Latin. Terrible, I know. Healthy, clean, and safe. You can experience these environmental virtues in a suburb if you are rich enough, but only a certain kind of place, an open city, will stimulate you. And that stimulation comes in a peculiar form. Jacobs says in a famous declaration, if density and diversity give life, the life they breed is disorderly. The open city feels like Naples. The closed city feels like Frankfurt. An entire school of urbanism has arisen on this foundation, practical as well as analytic. Analytically, it avers that big capitalism and powerful developers tend to favor closure and homogeneity, determinate, predictable, and balanced in form. The role of the radical planner, therefore, will be to champion dissonance. In practical planning, for instance, if a city is opened up, it will allow jerry-built adaptations or additions to existing buildings. It will encourage the use of public spaces which don't neatly fit together, such as putting an AIDS hospice in the middle of a shopping mall. The stimulations of such an open city might seem a larger reflection of William Emerson's bon mot that the arts result from overcrowding. Yet there's a divide among open city urbanists who share this general frame of mind. Jacobs privileges spontaneous combustion. Crowd people together informally, and they will compete, collude, gossip, innovate. It's sheer physical density in itself, which is the stimulus. Sympathetic as I've always been to her, here we've parted company. In a very nice fashion. We, as long as she lived, we argued. To me, the spatial forms density takes are what matter in stimulating people. The physical, that is, the physical character of the city, its physical design, urban design, as design, does not figure much in her version of the open city. The art of design matters much more in my own work. And I'd like to show you tonight 3 ways in which I think an open city can be designed. These designs involve creating ambiguous edges between parts of the city, contriving incomplete forms in building, and planning for unresolved narratives of development. That is, I'm going to talk to you about the design of ambiguity, incompleteness, and unresolved narratives. As I said, we could explore each into the small hours of the morning, so I'll try to say all too briefly what is my own approach. Let's start with ambiguity, which is a matter of ambiguous edges. Stephen Gould draws our attention to an important distinction in natural ecologies between 2 kinds of edges, boundaries and borders. The boundary is an edge where things end. The border is an edge where different groups interact. At borders, organisms become more interactive due to the meeting of different species or physical conditions. For instance, where the shoreline of a lake meets solid land is an active zone of exchange where organisms find and feed off one another. Not surprisingly, it's also at the borderline where the work of natural selection is the most intense. Whereas a boundary is a guarded territory, as established, for instance, by prides of lions or packs of wolves, there's no transgression that's meant to occur at the border. Keep out, which means that the edge, this kind of edge, is a dead is dead, is inert. That's its point. So the basic idea in this distinction is between, if you call this a very fancy thing, the living edge and the inert edge. The edge which is intense and the edge which is low intensity. We want as well to consider another natural edge condition, that at the cellular level. And this is the distinction between a cell wall and a cell membrane. The cell wall retains as much as possible internally. It is analogous to a boundary. The cell membrane is more open, more like a border. And I'm going to just show you, I did some work at MIT on this, and I'll just show you what we're doing. This is a membrane, plasma membrane. These are some of the cell wall, its general conditions. Can you read all of this? It doesn't matter. It's a plasma membrane. This is a cell wall. You can see how the actual structure of the wall, you can see how the structure of the wall is quite different from the membrane, where there are like these little breathing things, where stuff goes in and out. And of course, in most cells, there's a switch in function between border and boundary. And we did some quite interesting work on gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, how that plays out. It was very interesting to me. The membrane, I want to say, does not function like, the membrane reveals something important about what open itself means generically. The membrane does not function like an open door. A cell membrane is both porous and resistant at the same time. Let me go back to mine. It's both porous and resistant, holding in some valuable elements, letting other valuable elements flow through into the membrane, and discharging elements which are valuable to other cells. This is a terribly important thing, that openness is not an absence of form. It's a particular kind of structure which allows a contrary condition to occur at the same time. Think of the distinction as between wall and membrane as a difference in degree. At the cellular level, however, conservation and resistance are part of the equation which produces openness. Now, these natural differences between boundary wall and border membrane clarify open and closed built form. It's sometimes said about my work that it's very biologically based and that I'm an organicist, and it's true. I am. The urban habitat is cut up, as we know, into segregated parts by streams of traffic, by functional isolation between zones for work, commerce, family, and the public realm. I've argued that these are, in a way, the creation of a certain kind of an extrapolation of the boundary function in natural ecologies. Oops, I'm going to turn this off. This is my office going mad. that these are extrapolations of certain kind of natural ecology in humanly built form. Now, the most popular form of new residential development internationally, the gated community, takes to extreme the idea of the boundary wall. And the result is, I'll just show you one. This is one, do you know where this is? This is Johannesburg, one of the poorest cities in the world. This is mostly whites, upper class whites. And the result of building something like this with its wall is that exchange between different ethnic, racial, or class communities diminishes. So what we want to do is build a border membrane. Only connect. E.M. Forster's injunction may seem pious and well-meaning, but it has some disturbing implications in urban design. I'll give you an example from my own planning practice. Some years ago, I was involved in plans for creating a market to serve the Hispanic community of Spanish Harlem in New York. This community, one of the poorest in the city, lies above 96th Street on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Just below 96th Street, I'm talking about 20 years ago, in an abrupt shift, lies one of the richest communities in the world, running from 96th down to 59th, comparable to Mayfair in London or the 7e arrondissement in Paris. Now, when people usually imagine where the life of a community is to be found, they usually look for it in the center of the community. And to strengthen community life, planners try and intensify a life at the center, which means neglecting the edge condition. Thus, my team chose to locate La Marqueta in the very center of Spanish Harlem, 20 blocks away from the edge. I'll show you what we did. That's a subway line up there, and basically we just built underneath it, we built a community market. Thrilling to shop there because every time the subway passes overhead, the bottles all jiggle and whatnot, but it was wonderful. And we regarded 96th Street as a dead edge, as a boundary, where nothing much could happen. Now, we chose very wrongly. Had we located the market on that street, on that edge condition, we might have encouraged activity which brought the rich and the poor into some daily physical activity with each other. Even just to go out to buy a bottle of milk at La Marqueta at 11 at night. The lady in her mink fur and the lady's maid in her hoodie would stand in line together buying bottles of milk. It's not dialogue as Jürgen Habermas imagines interaction, but it's physical co-presence. And in segregated conditions, physical co-presence is something. You have no physical co-presence here. And what you have in place of actually seeing the other is fantasies about the other. That's also true here. Wiser planners have since learned from our mistake, and on the west side of Manhattan sought to locate new community resources at the edges between communities, in order, as it were, to make porous borders. This wisdom is a form of visual social creation. It doesn't happen naturally. This is what's natural, okay? It is Pache Jane Jacobs, form-making, and Pache Nicholas Luhmann, a spatial poiesis. So a lot of my planning work has now focused on researching, finding, and making boundaries into borders. That's work I do at my center in London. I'd like to talk next about incomplete form. Incomplete form is a creative credo. In the plastic arts, it's conveyed in sculpture, which is purposely left unfinished. In poetry, it is conveyed in, to use Wallace Stevens' phrase, the, quote, engineering of the fragment. So beautiful. The architect Peter Eisenman has sought to evoke something of the same credo in the term light architecture, meaning an architecture planned so that it can be added to, or more importantly, revised internally in the course of time as the needs of habitation change. This form of building is the antidote to the overdetermined city I spoke of earlier. Now, incomplete form is not as easy to design as it might seem. Form and function need to be lightly connected, if not actually divorced. The reason is that as the function of a building changes, historically, the form can only adapt if it's not overdetermined. If, like a Georgian row house, the form is simple, in this case basically a box in the form of a shoebox, a building in the form of a shoebox, then it can be flexible. But most modern buildings, especially tall ones, have complex infrastructures for lighting, heating, and plumbing. It's hard to make this infrastructure adapt to new purposes. For instance, recent efforts by myself and others to convert office towers on Wall Street into apartment buildings have proved costly and unsatisfying. I'll just show you one example. I'm obsessed by this old building here. This is the Woolworth Tower. It's one of the great buildings of the modern times. We're trying to convert, or we tried to convert, basically these parts of the building into residences rather than offices, and even to make it into some of them into social housing, which is a real wow in New York. Here's what happens when you try and do this. You've got a structure which is extreme. To do this, we had to strip the building back to its shell. This is extremely expensive. You see don't let me get started on this, I'll just say one thing about this. These are not natural beams. These are beams I had to put in because the building would collapse. It's designed for one function. And to make it into another function, you basically have to try and torture this building in its infrastructure into another form. And I have to say we failed in this project because it became so expensive. It would have been easier to tear down this huge, imagine that, cheaper to tear down this whole building and start over than to engage in this and keep the exterior. Now, that said, incomplete form challenged the design ideal of a physical object as fit for purpose. This is a really important point. Instead, the challenge of incomplete form is how to use new technologies to make buildings both simpler and more flexible in operation. Fit for purpose is a recipe for slavery, for design slavery. Once we break the stranglehold of function on form, once our buildings are less tightly fit for purpose, they can become living, evolving structures. Understanding this is also important even if you aren't an urban designer, because incomplete form is a basic principle in the good conduct of social life in general. I'm very argumentative, so stay with me on that. In sociology, incomplete form goes by the name of dialogics. In everyday social life, That's what we mean by good listening skills, or by sensing what people mean to say but can't find exactly the right words for, or by putting disconnected bits of ideas together when people talk to one another. In all these cases, we acknowledge that people do not think or speak in Flaubert's perfectly concise and clear sentences. More, we recognize that they may be struggling with ideas or emotions too complicated to be expressed in fluent and, as it were, well-greased prose. If I could just insert here, dialogics is about what kind of Etonian speech suppresses. That is, the hesitancies, difficulties that make you less than fluent. Sorry about that. Well-greased prose. And so we are obliged to interpret silences or fragments or to make sense of incomplete expression. This rich texture can be diminished if in a schoolmasterly fashion we would declare, "What you really mean to say is," or, "To be clear, you have made the following 3 points." Dialogics is the study of that complexity which transcends clarity. I'll say that again. Dialogics is the study of that complexity which transcends clarity. Moreover, ambiguity and indirectness can play a liberating role in social relations. They can both provoke us and make us reflect. And these virtues are, I believe, as productive in constructing the physical world as in making good social relationships. At the urban scale, finally, the same logic of incompleteness applies to what I'll call unresolved narratives of development. And here I come to the end. Unresolved narrative. Lastly, let us consider The Bodice Ripper or other sentimental novel. All the incidents of such a well-made narrative get resolved by the end, when a satisfying catharsis occurs in which everything falls into place. The servant girl heroine marries the lord of the manor, or the villain is finally unmasked and slinks off into the shadows. The narrative has clarity. In technical terms, it's linear, which means the plot pushes forward as in a straight line sequence. Linear narratives contrast to dialogical sequences. A clarifying meaning appears in the linear narrative, at least in Victorian fictional ones, whereas in dialogics, things can get more and more cloudy. Most simply, the linear narrative aims forward at a conclusion, whereas the dialogical encounter emphasizes sheer process. Now, planning a closed city is indeed equivalent to plotting a bodice ripper. The closed-minded planner wants, do you know what a bodice ripper is? Yeah. That's a joke that perhaps I don't like. The closed-minded planner wants to envision from the very first all the results at the end. And unfortunately, planning law in Britain demands such specification down to the most minor details of sidewalk height and width or lighting intensity on the street. A surprising discovery about subsurface or local ambience is treated as interfering with the plan, as getting in the way of realizing the objective. Lockstep linear clarity from beginning to end is meant to rule realization. Real life rarely follows the script of a linear narrative, and in the actual process of development, this compulsive clarity is rarely practical. Nonetheless, in all planning work, we are thinking in terms of narrative, in another sense of that word. We focus on the stages in which a particular project unfolds. This can be a matter of the if and then sort of logical thinking. I've done this, so what comes next? Or it can be a more adventurous logic. What if? I've done this. What if now we did something like that? But still we are trying to think out events in terms of consequences rather than a random series, which is basically narrative. Planning in the open city, like open systems in mathematics and the natural world, should therefore embrace nonlinear forms of sequence. Over the years, I've evolved a way of working with clients which involves rolling evaluations at critical stages of work. We've repriced schools, cut or added rooms to health clinics, changed the specifications for kitchens and bathrooms and housing as the work moved along. I've tried to combine my own stubborn authority with a certain kind of democracy in this rolling process. I decide when the critical stage of a rethink has arrived, and my clients, usually local communities, do most of the rethinking. I'm going to show you one. I can't forbear to show you one project here. I worked on the remaking of the Green Line in Beirut in the 1990s. There was 15 years of civil war in the Lebanon, largely, well, it's very complicated, but put it simply between Christians and Muslims. And the city of Beirut was absolutely destroyed. Here, in this section of the city, this is the Green Line, so-called because in some places, you can see this couple getting married in it. The climate meant that trees grew up between the two sides. On one side were Muslims, I hate using that as, but people who were non-Christian, and on the other side were Christians. And they fired across each other, and in time, this is what you got. Here's where the Green Line, this is it's Sunnis and Shias, this is Christians, this is Green Line. I'm very unhappy about these, but basically, the Christians are here, and Islamic groups who are fighting each other as well here are also fighting the Christians here. Now, what we did was apply this method in the reconstruction of this site with money provided by the Hariri family, who are in turn really front people for the Saudis, who gave the money, but they gave it. That's fine. And we arrived, this is the street 8 years after we began. So it looked like the same street. Now, this may look to you like a rather dull, not very innovative street result. But it comes out of a series of negotiations which I staged, in which people who had formerly been shooting at each other instead resolved on how they wanted to talk to each other about how they wanted to rebuild the street. And one of the things that they found out was that basically they wanted both sides of the street to be the same. This was a profound discovery on both their sides, that they both wanted their side of the street, the same forms on the street. It was a kind of political coming together in which politics was never mentioned. And each one of the configurations of each one of these apartments behind the facades is quite different. Well, let's say the Shia part of this, where we are here, has the stairwells are also social spaces. That is, that families hang out in the stairwells, so I put in big skylights for them. On the Christian side, the stairwell is just a service thing. It's not a social space. But, people talk this through. I was like more than a designer, I think I was like a kind of stage manager, saying when people had to talk. And the way our method works in particular is we build out of styrofoam models of various alternatives, because most people, when they look at a physical site, they don't want. What do you mean lintels? What is a lintel, you know? So we build these styrofoam models. We have 3 or 4 alternatives on a table, and that gives something for people to discuss. They can pick the styrofoam up. They're very easy to cut on styrofoam. I'm now using this wonderful 3D program on the web, so I just plot the styrofoam on screen, and it's cut automatically. It's very beautiful and very accurate. But anyhow, it's a discursive, the models are discursive objects. You understand how that works? And that leads to something like this. Not very shishi, but it means that people feel they've taken ownership of this street together. Now, this may just seem like common sense to you. In a good scientific laboratory, rolling evaluation should be the normal practice. But this practice drives urban planning authorities up the wall. And it may be one of the reasons I don't get to do as much practical work in Britain as I'd like. It drives them up the wall. So I ask you just for one paragraph more to indulge my frustration, or perhaps it's my neurosis. Imagine a scientist in the lab who declares, I'm just going to test a hypothesis, right or wrong. If the experiment throws up some extraneous matters to that test, I'm going to ignore these matters. Now, this would be a very mediocre scientist indeed. Or if a novelist were to announce at the beginning of a story, here's what will happen, what the characters will become, and what the story means, we would not bother to read this book. Open city planning attends to conflicts and possibilities in sequence. There's problem solving, but there's also problem finding. Discovery rather than merely clarity. All good narrative is the property of exploring the unforeseen. The novelist's art is to shape that process, and the urbanist designer's art is akin. To conclude, in this talk, I've compressed a big contrast, that between the closed and the open city. Closed means overdetermined, balanced, and integrated, linear. Open means incomplete, errant, conflictual, non-linear. The closed city is full of boundaries and walls. The open city possesses more borders and membranes. The closed city can be designed and operated top-down. It's a city which belongs to the masters. The open city can be a bottom-up place. It can belong to the people. These contrasts, of course, are not absolutes of black and white. Real life is always painted in grays. Yet to design the modern city well, I believe we have to challenge unthinking assumptions now made about urban life, assumptions which favor closure. I believe we have to embrace less reassuring, more febrile ideas of living together. Those stimulations of difference, both visual and social, which produce openness. Thank you very much.